Hello, and welcome to Regrets I've Had a Few. I'm Paul Hunter, Artistic Director of Told by an Idiot, and this is a podcast where I talk to friends and colleagues delving into what made them the person they are today. Hello, and welcome. My guest this month is one of Britain's most original writers. He operates at the intersection of science and literature and is consistently uncategorizable. From his wonderfully poetic and eclectic collection of mini narratives that make up The Absent Therapist to his astonishing award-winning novel Murmur, there's no one quite like him. Welcome, Will Eaves.
Very nice to be here. Thank you, Paul.
Well, it's lovely to have you join us. And I should say, I've missed our chats down at the BFI, and we were just talking before this. So this makes up for it in some way, although we are recording it.
They seem so long ago, don't they? I assume they must have been before COVID, although it
definitely,
seems
definitely a strange period when the world felt normal, but we won't dwell on that. We'll dwell on other things. Now, obviously, I'm going to dwell largely on your brilliant writing, which has had a big impact on me. But I want to start with performance, because I know that's also something close to your heart and in your life. And I want to take you way back. Do you have any memory of any very early performance that you might have done, whether it was in school or church or?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, I suppose that quite a lot of my early experience of acting and singing and playing music was barely conscious in a way. I grew up in a rather sort of it felt like quite a large family, although it probably wasn't very, large for the time. Four kids, and I shared a room with my brother, and he was quite a sort of very funny person, but a real introvert, and I was sort of slightly different, I suppose. And I was drawn to this piano that stood rather uselessly in our shared bedroom, and he had his sort of little bed with toy soldiers on one side, and I had my kind of sort of rather, it's almost a cot really. It was a rather small bed on the other, but the piano was a wonderful iron frame instrument inherited from my grandmother, and it had superb marquetry on it. Very simple but superb, because it was all scored and engraved in various sort of floral patterns, and it was a Rudy Bach Zon piano. And I can't remember a time when I didn't want to sit at it and play it. And it wasn't, I think, because I understood really what music was or felt that I had a musical gift, but this sort of jaw of teeth that were the keys invited me to lay my hands upon them and sort of move my fingers up and down. So I think that's my earliest memory of performance, and I think it was also a bit of a refuge. It was identifiably mine and no one else's. No one else wanted to play it. No one else showed any interest. So it was a very plausible means of beating a retreat from quite a loud family.
Oh, that's a very fantastic insight into your childhood there, a snapshot. And I've got that's a very, very clear image. Was theatre something that you were taken to? Did you go as a family, or?
Well, I think I grew up at a time when, in the rather like you, I'm sure, in the 70s. No, we didn't go as a family to theatre, but I was very drawn to film. There are a lot of good black and white films on telly in those days on BBC Two, and I sort of watched my way, pretty religiously through the Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce Sherlock Holmes movies, and also the sort of early 1930s Universal Studios horror movies, which were on very late at night. And if I went to bed early, I was allowed to then get up again and watch these. They were only about sort of 50 minutes long, but although I didn't realize at the time, very heavily influenced by German expressionism. I loved all the shadow play. That if you're looking for a kind of trope in 1930s film, it's often sort of shadows fighting each other, which is sort of taken straight from Dr. Caligari, which I
Yeah.
subsequently found out was the case. But and culminating, I suppose, in the fantastic shadow sword fight between Claude Rains and Basil Rathbone in The Adventures of Robin Hood.
Yes.
They come down the staircase. So I think it was probably cinema rather than theatre that originally took my fancy. But when I did come to sort of be in school plays and things, I can't remember a time when it didn't feel very natural to me to to want to get on the stage and show off. And there's no way of making it, sound like anything other than it was. Just the need to throw one's inner life into sharp relief. And I think that's probably what's behind a lot of performance for a lot of people. It's not so much that they consciously want to show off. It's that it's such a kind of sort of necessary purge for the rest of your life, which is so interior.
I think it's very interesting coming back to the beginning of that when you mentioned cinema and those films that were shown when we were kids, being of a similar age. And I totally remember watching those double bills of those the Universal horrors. I also remember being obsessed with Jimmy Cagney and the Warner Brothers gangster movies, which were also shown. And I don't know about you, but I have a memory. This might have been on a Sunday evening where they used to show a lot of European films, which I was far too young to watch. And my parents brilliantly, and I think rather neglectfully, just let me stay up. I don't think it was anything about broadening my mind. It was just them not being conscious. Did you ever, and I have a memory, very vivid memory of seeing Don't Look Now, when I was far too young to see it and being terrified by the blind woman who could see. And
yes,
do you remember those kind of movies?
Yes, I do. It was after the 9:30 watershed, wasn't it, on a Sunday evening? And you've
Yes.
only really just reminded me of it now. But yeah, I do. That, and they you simply wouldn't be programmed now for any number of reasons. But yeah,
no.
I mean, in the Nick Roeg films, occasionally you got these kind of quite new movies, and I guess Don't Look Now is 1972, 73, so it was only about 5 years old by the time watching it. And I'm not sure when I first saw that. I think I saw it a bit later than that. And I remember similarly being, it's a very scary movie, and it's very brilliantly done. And there's a lot of silence in it.
Yes,
it's unusual for the time. Not least the extraordinary sex scene, which I think got cut out for the TV.
It was
Inevitably
it was removed before
it was. And then I remember, I went to this sort of big, but I think in a way quite enlightened, comprehensive. And we had a film club in the sixth form, which was shared with all the other schools in Bath, and it was actually a real highlight of the. I think we had a film every 2 weeks or something. And I was on the committee one year choosing films, and I chose Don't Look Now. And I think there must have been some debate, in the staff room about whether this was really suitable material for children who weren't yet 18. But anyway, we got the film, and it was an intact, edition. And you could have heard a pin drop, of course.
I think
all these people with their sort of, emergent couples, the emergent boyfriends and girlfriends, suddenly having this kind of really being dropped in at the deep end. This is how it's done, lads. No one said a word.
I can imagine, as you curated that particular season when you were on the committee, that was probably one of your hit films of that season, I imagine.
I think
in many ways.
That, and there was another Donald Sutherland movie, which was a terrible movie, really, but was very enjoyable, called Eye of the Needle, which was a sort of Eye of the Needle. It's a terrible World War II thriller set on a sort of abandoned rock somewhere. Kate Nelligan and Donald Sutherland, and there's a lot of that kind of rather unnecessary 70s and 80s female nudity in it, where sort of people are half
Yes.
caught in the threshold. They're sort of, you know, with nothing on. Oh, that sort of thing.
Yes. Well, we can move swiftly on from that, Will. And I suppose we talk about performance. What about your early memories of writing? When was writing something that you started to do, and how did it happen?
So that has a very clear point of origin. My brother was a writer, and a very good one, in my memory. I don't have much to do with him anymore. He's quite a, I mean, I don't think I'm betraying him, but he's quite a difficult character, and I'm sure he may think the same of me. But he was a very good writer, and he had these series of red and black notebooks in which he wrote in a marvelous kind of cursive hand these tales of the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, writing seemed to come to him so naturally. It just flowed out of him in this stream of sort of wonderfully musical prose, but accurate and witty, and marvelously shaped argument at the same time. It was like a kind of little education in itself. And we went on holiday, and he bought a particular notebook abroad. It was a grey notebook, or my mother bought it for him. And he filled it with these extraordinary drawings of battles and Borodino, and then sort of began rewriting the story of the Napoleonic Wars in his own voice. And of course, I didn't read them too much later. And all I wanted to do was sort of emulate the act of writing. I knew I couldn't do that, and I was only about 7, so I asked for a smaller notebook. And without thinking about it too hard, I'd read and really enjoyed, and had read to me, things like Peacock Pie by Walter de la Mare. And again, I can't remember making the conscious decision, but I started writing poems. So the first things I wrote were poems, and I sort of filled the notebook with these poems, and they were full of that kind of slightly dementing perception of the world and freedom that you have when you don't know what you're doing and don't care what you're doing for the first time. Mm-hmm. And one way of describing that is saying, as Winnicott would say, that it's pure play. But I'm not sure that it is pure play, because you do it quite seriously. You know, if you look at a child making their first steps in an art form, I always feel it's not quite accurate to say they're just playing. Play is something else. What they're doing is trying to be serious, actually. You know, even if they're writing funny stories, they're trying to. It always seems to me that what a child really wants is to be taken seriously. Definitely. And not really just as a child. And that's the problem, of course. That's why, I mean, I think if I were a child now, I'd find the whole kind of YA fiction thing very difficult to handle. I'd feel patronized. But I mean, I know that's a minority view, but
I don't know. It's interesting when you touch on that idea of play, and it's something obviously that lies at the heart of our work at Told by an Idiot. But we take the notion of play very seriously. It's I very consciously don't think there is a contradiction in that at all. I think
that's a good way of putting it, isn't it? I mean, I suppose that what you're trying to find often is a way of being, productively disinhibited again. Once you get past a certain point in life, so many things crop up, be they social or familial or intellectual, that make you feel you can't freewheel.
Definitely. And it's interesting. Obviously, you touch on the notion of the first things that you were drawn to writing or an expression in writing was the poetry, which clearly has stayed with you always in various shapes and forms in your writing. There's a deep sense of poetry to it, which is extraordinary, combined obviously with many other things. But you then obviously went through school and then to university, and it was university where the acting thing kicked
I
in?
think it was. I think I sort of did, and did really enjoy doing an English degree, and it was marvelous to be in a place that had such great sort of libraries and resources. But I think that my unofficial degree was sort of in light entertainment, really. I tell you a book that I'd read at the time that made a big impression on me, because I was, and I was sort of in the, I was, I knew I was gay, but I was in the closet and I didn't know what to do about that. And so it was a sort of, acting was a salutary distraction in some ways from some of that. Don't know if it was anxiety. I think it was anxiety about it, really. It was at the very time that the AIDS pandemic had a stranglehold on activities, and I did and didn't want to be known for myself, and being someone else, being given permission to be someone else, or rather to be oneself in others' shoes, as Harriet Walter put it in that lovely book she wrote, in other people's shoes. Was very attractive, and also a very good way of finding out. It would seem to me that when you act, you take possession of something, a stage, but you have certain guy ropes, and the guy ropes may be a script, or they may be direction, or they may be something that you've sort of arrived at as a troupe, if it's a sort of semi-improvised thing. But it's that idea of productively constrained freedom is a lovely,
I can totally
is a lovely
totally relate
thing.
to that.
And it's a very, I think it's a very good way of sort of, for me, it's an amazingly important way of giving actually a lot of my emotions some structure, when I felt the need otherwise. This was at Cambridge, to I was worried about how good my work was, whether I was really clever enough to be there. I never felt that particularly, and I found the work challenging and interesting but difficult. And so there was always that sort of, am I good enough, is this good enough thing that was going on with the university work, and none of that applied when you set foot on the stage, because you just had to step into the moment.
Absolutely, and obviously be utterly present, which is a key thing. You mentioned you read a book, but you didn't say what book it was.
The book was A Liar's Autobiography by Graham Chapman. One of the deceased members of the Monty Python team. And to this day, I mean, he obviously had written it with about 4 other people, and it makes a joke of it halfway through. Barry Cryer and various other people that helped him cobble it together, because he was sort of, half drunk most of the time. But it is, to this day, I think, one of the funniest books I've ever read. It's very, very, very good.
I shall look that up.
Very, very good.
Look that up. I like it when someone has a key book that they've read. And then, did you? At what point did you decide to give acting a go? If you sort of mean, thinking, okay, now I'm going to go.
Well, it came as it felt to me a very natural thing to do. Once I was up and running on a stage, I mean, I got very nervous. I got very, very nervous before every performance. I would sort of religiously go through all my lines the afternoon beforehand for everything, whatever I did. So I took it, quite seriously. I think I decided, well, you said in our sort of pre-on-air exchange that you might touch lightly on the idea of regrets. I mean, I suppose it's not a major regret, but it's of some regret to me that I didn't take the acting further, because what happened was I think I got into a couple of drama schools. I actually can't now remember. Webber Douglas was one of them. Maybe Central was the other or something. But then, of course, the issue of money came up, and I just didn't have any, and my parents didn't have any, and I'd had a grant to get through university, and I think it looked very unlikely that I would get another to do essentially a postgraduate course. So it just didn't look. It was the first time I became aware of actually there being financial differences between me and quite a lot of other people who went somewhere like that. And I don't say that in any kind of embittered way, but it was just a fact.
Yeah, no,
so
for sure.
I'd done a lot of shows, and and I'd felt quite at home, and I think I can't really tell what they were like. I'm sure they were just, I'm sure they were just grandiose versions of school plays, really, but they felt like something. And I felt it was something I could do. And then I did it for a year, and I got my equity card. And then almost as soon as I was doing it, I thought, I don't think this is going to be very easy for me to do, and it's probably not sensible, and I haven't got the money, and I might not be the sort of person just to stay at home waiting for the phone to ring. And there was an awful lot of, you encountered everywhere you went, people saying, if there's something else you can do, you should do that. And I, to this day, don't.
And was that?
Sorry, to this day, I don't know whether that's actually good advice or not, really.
No, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I remember being given advice by my sister and my mother, who were very concerned about me from going into the world of show business for a variety of reasons. I think majorly because there was no context for it. My mom was a dinner lady and my dad was an electrician, and they had no, this wasn't what people did from my part of Birmingham. But I remember being given the advice, why don't you go to university? You're good at English. You can get a degree and then you'll have something to fall back on. And I remember as an angry teenager shouting back, if I have something to fall back on, I will fall back on it.
Well, you were just much, though you probably didn't know it at the time, I think you were much wiser than I.
Well,
yeah.
I don't know.
Well, no, it's absolutely true. I think that's been a huge, I mean, I still have this sense that it's a very, very powerful thing with me. And in a sense, life has gone on too far for me to quite disentangle it. But I've had such a strong sense all my life that I'm not quite doing the thing I should be doing.
Even with your writing?
Yeah, definitely.
Wow.
Big parts.
That's really, that's very interesting.
Yeah, because I don't know what, in a sense, I don't know what that thing should be anymore. And it's a source of some grief to me. I think the thing is, when you do something for long enough, of course, it does become your nature. It becomes the thing. It's part of. It's all very well going to a therapist and saying, well, of course, it's not you, it's what you do. But the two things become more or less indistinguishable from each other after a certain point. And the fact is that I have, in terms of artistic production, most of it has been writing. Although only now and recently, I mean, absent therapist in a way gave me a chance to go back to being an actor again, because because I suddenly realized that the way to solve a particular problem I had about, what do I write next, was simply to scour my notebooks for any kind of likely situation, and instead of turning it into a sort of full-scale narrative, simply to turn the notes into monologues or vignettes.
And that's what's so brilliant about it, Will. That's what's so fantastic, is when you read it, and I've seen you do bits of it in a sense, in a performative way, but that's what makes it so unique, I think. It's kind of, it grabs you in a very, very particular way. And maybe some of that is from a kind of performative place, even when it's words on the page.
And I always love the kind of performance that, starts that where you're sort of dropped in something straight away. There's next to no setup. You're suddenly in a situation. You don't quite know why you're in it, and you don't necessarily know even who's speaking.
Totally agree.
Totally agree. Because it's interesting. The spectator or the reader is immediately curious, and it's disorientating, and it's funny. And I love making people laugh. I mean, I do have a strong memory of saying to my friend Heather at school, what I'd really like, I'd actually like to be a comedian. And whether I did really want that or not is sort of not the point. I think I was saying at the time something quite true. And funnily enough, I've just started doing these sort of videos of just out of boredom or frustration, again, with writing, I'm stuck with a bit of writing. And so I've started doing these sort of characters who are, some of them based on real people, many of them not, which are usually just responses to things I've heard. And they're just 2-minute little versions of absent therapist type things in different voices. And I like the way that different personae and different accents and different attitudes give you a view of different possibilities about yourself and about other people. And they remind you that we are aspectual, you know, that there's actually many different ways of looking at the same mountain or the same person.
Yeah.
And I love all that.
I mean, that's what I think it's worth saying for people, maybe listeners who don't know that collection or that book, is it's very funny. That's also why I really liked it.
Thank you.
It really made me laugh, and I think that's well, obviously I'm very fascinated by comedy in terms of what we do with the company, and we often talk about trying to inhabit the space between laughter and pain, and we find that a very creative place to be. And it struck me at times that in your work I've had a similar kind of feeling where I go, I'm not to pigeonhole it, but I felt, I really like the place that you put the reader in. And you're very,
I'm so pleased.
funny.
I'm so pleased you think that. It's an absolutely thrilling thing to hear. Thank you.
Well, this brings me, I suppose, to obviously it had a big effect on me, Murmur, which obviously was an incredibly, rightfully successful book for you. And you're very funny when you talk about how some of your early novels didn't sell many copies. You say yourself. And were you surprised? How surprised, or were you surprised that a book that is very, very, in some ways, very experimental with its form and its style, became an award-winning? Did it surprise you?
Yeah,
in a way,
it did. I mean, I think I have to. I did feel I was flying blind a lot of the time while I was writing it. The only thing that guided me, actually, rather like this business of being on stage, was that a constraint guided me. I'd found my way to this subject matter, which was the later years of Alan Turing and his sense of himself as man in pain, suffering something that didn't fall strictly within the purview of the material science to which he was so wedded. I was wondering, so Turing's arrested for having sex with a man. The terms of his probation are that he takes this organotherapy, this punitive hormone therapy. He grows breasts, commits suicide 2 years later. And I wondered what that sort of personal transformation and pain would be like for somebody who viewed the world through the lens of third-party scientific method, who took the removal of nuance and personal bias and opinion from his work so seriously. What would it be like for a person like that to feel such exquisitely personal pain? And I'm sure he was aware of the irony. So in a way, the whole book is strung upon a dawning sense of the horror of that irony, that all this time, all his sort of brilliance about computing machinery and intelligence is suddenly derailed by the personal experience, which doesn't and sort of can't figure in his worldview. And so the whole book is about that aspect of the self that is never expressed by a life and how it finds belated expression. And maybe it is an accident or a coincidence, and maybe not. But at the time I was writing it, I was in a lot of physical pain myself. And it suddenly struck me so forcefully that when you are in a lot of constant pain, it's very difficult to communicate it to other people. That your physical body won't necessarily betray the condition you're really in. Yeah. So the writing became about that. and we've talked, you know, in this little conversation quite a bit about the gaps and the spaces between laughter and pain, and between presenting as one thing and actually feeling another. And it just seemed to me a subject worth writing about. And if I could get to the end of it, a subject that would interest people. Now, I should say that it actually didn't, it wasn't at any point a bestseller, but I kind of knew that thought I knew that I was doing something that was that was a worthwhile and important experiment. And I think that's the purest reason for doing difficult things like that. Not that people will like it in the end, not that you think they'll buy it particularly, or that it will win an award, but ultimately that for reasons that must always remain mysterious, this thing has to be done. And that's what
I think that's brilliantly. That's very brilliantly and very eloquently put, and particularly also when you talk about a worthwhile experiment. And I think the sense of continuing to experiment is really crucial, I think, in any form. You know, I at the weekend I was at the William Kentridge exhibition at the Royal Academy, which is absolutely amazing.
I must go and see it because
it's brilliant. It's brilliant. And his continual sense of exploring form and content at the same time in so many different ways, and that's what I love about your work. It's endlessly fluid in that sense, but I can totally relate to the notion of restriction, or you know, that for me is as someone who improvises a lot, you're reliant all the time on restriction.
Totally. I mean, it never comes out of nowhere. I mean, I think the sort of great misconception about you know, improvisation is that it's it's sort of thoughtless spontaneity, and it's not. It's the reverse of that. And I think and it becomes clear that it's the reverse if you think of it in musical terms. I think, you know, that's then you realize that actually there's sort of no such thing really as improvisation in that pejorative sense, because it's just a kind of more immediate and present composition, but you're drawing on everything you already know and think about something, and those are your grounds of knowledge. And in acting, you're inhabitants of this thing that's your body, and your awareness of its changing nature and its age and its the things it can do and the things it can't do. And as soon as you think of those two things, actually a world of emotion opens up for you, whether you're creating a character in the moment or whether you're playing a character that's been scripted.
No, I totally agree. With when we last chatted or recently chatted, you mentioned the notion that there might be some interest in an adaptation of Murmur. Is that still the case, or you mentioned a film possibility? If you can't speak about it, that's absolutely fine.
I can speak about it. Yeah, so I wrote. I was commissioned to write a film version of it, and I did that. I duly wrote a screenplay, and then it was felt that the screenplay would sit better as a 3-part TV series, and so I've expanded it into a 3-part TV series, and now it's felt that its natural form is as a single feature again. So I've got to sort of do a third draft. I actually really like the commissioning producer at Seven Screen who's taken this on. I mean, you know, it's not, you know, I'm not doing it for free, and he's taking a real risk with it. So I really take my hat off to him. But at the same time, I'm a bit nervous because I don't know how much. Once you get to your third draft of something like that, I'm wondering how much I have left in the tank in terms of reinvention of the original material.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And also, I mean, I am fascinated because it exists so brilliantly in the form it is, and then of course I'm then intrigued to how it could then be reinvented in another form. It's fascinating.
It's very, very different. It's very different, and my hope is that it would be visually very exciting.
Yes, that's immediately what I think about. You think the opportunity for an extraordinary visual interpretation of that story with the right people could be.
I think the difficulty is that the first 2 drafts I've done it's so out there in terms of the things I'm asking for. It's through composed, and you go from scene to scene, and you're never quite in the real world, and you're never quite in the Alec Pryor's head. But of course, ultimately, you have to get films funded. And and in a way, the question is not so much is this well or wonderfully imagined, as can people who are going to give you some money read the script and immediately see what they think the film might look like?
Yes,
which means you have to compromise.
Yes, inevitably.
And as you can imagine, Paul, I'm not very good at it.
Well, I look forward to continuing this conversation about the journey from page to the screen. We started by talking about German expressionism and those amazing Hollywood movies, and now we come full circle with maybe an audacious attempt of adapting that extraordinary. And I say to all the listeners, if you haven't read it, you must read it. It's extraordinary. Now, Will, just before we go, I always do this. I ask some random questions. You just need to say the first answer that comes into your head. It requires no thought. Here we go. Cary Grant or James Mason?
James Mason.
Boat to New York or the Orient Express?
The Orient Express.
This is on Disney, Walt Disney. Snow White or Pinocchio?
Snow White.
This on flowers, freesias or lilies?
Lilies. The flowers of death.
Virginia Woolf or Angela Virginia Woolf or Angela Carter?
Virginia Woolf. But Virginia Woolf for a specific reason. I mean, I actually love Angela Carter's fiction, but I think Virginia Woolf's best books, 2 books, are The Common Reader, volumes 1 and 2. The criticism,
I don't know them. I will go and seek them out.
The best, some of the best literary criticism I've ever read.
Right, I will do that. I have 3 more. Margate or Whitstable?
Margate.
Lucille Ball or Goldie Hawn?
Very difficult. Lucille Ball, very difficult, because actually both very good. Lucille Ball, I think.
Okay. And finally, it's more of an existential question. Crime or punishment?
Crime.
Will, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure and so fascinating to hear you talk about your work and how it arrives. And let's do a non-recorded social at the BFI.
That would be really great. Thank you, Paul, so much. I'm really indebted to you.
Not at all.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Dear listeners, if you've enjoyed this idiot podcast, please spread the word